Hello and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Last week, we talked about the misdeed of destroying another's crops. And today, we'll be looking at this idea of breaking up marriage, someone else's marriage. It's interesting how the two lines are put together, in a sense, because when you think about the first line, destroying another's crops, it is not just the destruction of an individual farmer's produce, which is obviously their livelihood, but ultimately it would be the destruction of the community's food staple, this food supply, which it was very, very important for an agricultural society such as traditional China. And even in early China, when these crops were used as the payment of taxes for the government. So this idea of destroying crops then is not just the destruction or harm towards one person, one farmer and their family, but actually to the community. And similarly, when we look at the second line, which is breaking up someone's marriage, what we'll discuss today and what we'll explore is that this idea of marriage is not something that's just between two people and then therefore just be harming that relationship, but actually it's something that has widespread sort of consequences. So this idea of breaking up someone's marriage, breaking up here in Chinese, that word also could be destroying, so causing division, separation. Marriage here, it could be during someone's marriage or even prior to their marriage, so in the engagement period prior to their nuptials. This marriage, it's important to understand, it's sort of referring to, in that historical context, a traditional marriage from the perspective of the traditional Chinese society. But it wasn't just what we might think of as a legally accepted union between two individuals. It was much more than that. And to get an idea of that traditional view of marriage, I'd like to refer to a particular passage from one of the Confucian classics called The Records of Ritual, in Chinese, Li Ji. So this extract here is taken from a chapter, the 44th chapter, called The Meaning of the Marriage Ceremony. And this part is actually the very first two sentences of that chapter. And the really nice picture that I have here is also illustrates, it's not from the book, it's a painting, and it illustrates, you could say, one of the stages of the marriage ceremony in which the bride, who's in the carriage, and her dowry behind her on the right, is going to her new home. So you can sort of see from the painting this great pomp and ceremony and all the people that are involved and that kind of atmosphere. So what was marriage to in traditional Chinese society? It says here that this ceremony of marriage was intended to be a bond of love between two surnames, or two families, different surnames. So what comes out here that's a bit different from our modern understanding of marriage, is that idea that it's not just between two people united by love, but actually between two families. And we're not just talking about families as in relatives who you might invite to the marriage ceremony, all the extended relatives, cousins, etc. But actually we're talking about the families stretching back into the past, including ancestors. So it's a union between two surnames, and the surname sort of stretching through time and space. So the union of two families, in the broader sense of the term family. And you can see that it says that the aim of this was to secure services in the ancestral temple. So we're talking about ancestors. These ancestors were commemorated on a regular basis throughout the year in their ancestral halls or temples. And the significance of this commemoration was actually to help the descendants, members of the family alive today, to understand the legacy of those who'd come before them. So what were their ancestors like? What were their achievements? What were their teachings, their work ethic, their way of life, and how could we continue these great values? So it was about learning that. It wasn't just the commemoration for the sake of ritual. And therefore, this so-called service in the ancestral temple is really not just about those ceremonies, but about how to live in honor of those who've come before us. So that family, this bond, this new family is created to honor the legacy of the ancestors, not just the parents, grandparents, etc., but even those before. And in a way, as it says, it's not just backward looking, but it's also forward looking. So that union was to continue the family line. Now, this continuation of the family line was not just about having children, it was about raising the children, nurturing, educating, and ensuring that they had good character, they could be responsible citizens and contribute to the community, and therefore bring joy and pride to the family, to that entire sort of lineage. So it was in a way, this concept was about the significance of this marriage was not just about the two people. Of course, the two people are very important, but this bringing together of families for those who come before and also those who are to come for one's descendants. And therefore, it says that this marriage ceremony, as the starting point of this union, was highly valued by noble persons. Now, these noble persons refers to the sage leaders of the past. We've heard of kings of the past, but in other words, they're trying to tell us that, if these great sage kings valued this kind of ceremony, then we should too. We should emulate them. We should also see the importance of it and understand its significance. So this is a very interesting view of this ceremony of marriage as a starting point to a union that is to bring joy, and not only joy, but also this idea of continuation and preservation of what came in the past, but for the future. And these ideas were not just in ancient China, early China, but continued throughout Chinese history. It wasn't just in those who were scholars who read these texts, but was part of popular culture. So this idea of the Confucian 5 relations, the idea that all our human relations can be thought of as 5 fundamental relations, which are listed here. But actually the very first was that of the relationship between spouses. And that was considered the origin of all the other relations. If you think about it, it's that marital union that then leads to children. So therefore the parent and child relationship, which then, if you have more than one child, creates the sibling relationship and others, etc. So that first relationship, the relationship between spouses, was very, very important, as we read before, highly valued. And it was about, ensuring that there was this harmony in the family that started with the spouses. So in this particular sentence taken from the extended wise sayings, sort of collection of proverbs or aphorisms from late imperial China, but also gives you a very good understanding of sort of common values, popular values of society at the time. And it talks about various relationships. So first of all, you can see parent and child are harmonious, and this ensures that the family won't break down. When siblings are harmonious, the family won't separate, particularly after the parents pass away. If community organizations are harmonious, then there's no need for litigation. And then the last line is that when spouses are harmonious, then the family prospers. Now, the family here, if you look at the words that are highlighted in blue, in Chinese, it's not just family, but there's another word after it, which would literally mean sort of the family estate, the way of the family, how that harmony within the family. And this, the family or the family estate, is quite interesting because when the spouses are, they work together to support each other. It's a partnership. Each person fulfills their responsibilities towards each other, but also towards the greater good, and that they provide a role model for their children, for the extended family. And it's through that harmony that the children also learn how it is to create, healthy relationships in their later lives. How also to be to fulfill their responsibilities as a spouse, as a parent, etc. So that's what it means here when it talks about the family prospering. It's not just in terms of the financial situation. It's much more than that. It's, yes, of course, if two people are working together harmoniously, then certainly this will lead to prosperity eventually. But ultimately, it's about the idea that the family itself, the future generations, will continue the family estate, the family teachings, the family values, and whether that involves, the family's work, let's say the company, but also their charitable work, their networks, their relationships with others, that will all prosper. And one family that gets along well provides a very good model for others. And that has that effect of harmony is multiplied when other people see this good relationship and they emulate. So therefore, this idea that when spouses are harmonious, this family will prosper is something that is, the scope of it should be considered on a wider level. I think this is particularly the case when we look in the historical works. And one of the ones that come to mind is that of the exemplary women of early China, that's been translated into English. In Chinese, it's the Lianyu Zhuan. And this was an anthology of stories of women taken from historical works compiled in around the 1st century BCE. And through this text, you get this sense and understanding of the great partnership between the spouses, that women were able to provide this great influence in various ways. So a classic example from this text is the influence of the 3 matriarchs of the Zhou state. And we know that the Zhou dynasty was was the longest in Chinese history. But how did that come about? Of course, you have the sage leaders like King Wen and King Wu. But how did they come about? Through great mother figures. And so the three names listed here, Tai Jiang, Tai Ren, Tai Si, as you can see, they are the partners of the successive leaders of the Zhou family. And this idea that, through their work, this great partnership, that the children were raised with great character, these sage kings, but also the partnership was such that they would work together with their spouses in providing a great model, a role model of these family relationships for the rest of the state. And we read about this in other classics like the Classic of Odes, etc. So these women were celebrated throughout Chinese history, so much so that even today, the word for the to venerate someone's wife, you would call them in Chinese Tai Tai, which comes from the names of these three matriarchs. The person who's pictured here on the left is Tai Si. So you get the sense that they were very celebrated, but they were celebrated because of this great partnership that led to one of the greatest dynasties in Chinese history. So having sort of that understanding of the impact and the importance of this marital bond or this union, you can see why in the Exalted Treatise is it considered a misdeed to break up someone else's marriage. So they may not necessarily be the leader of a state, but breaking up that marriage is not just breaking up two people, the lives of two individuals, and if they have children, the lives of their children, but also it's actually breaking up this bond, this affinity between two families. And then you can think of, this union was with the aim of preserving those teachings, those values of the past, carrying it on for the future. And what happens to that when they separate? So that's why it is such a misdeed. The idea of marriage in traditional times, this understanding was that it was predestined or it was fated in some way. So again, from the extended wise sayings, there is this line that one day as husband and wife is actually the result of 100 lifetimes of shared affinity. So we know that there was this popular belief, not just in the tradition of Buddhism, but even in other traditions, that this sort of Chinese popular thinking that there was more than just this one lifetime that we had. And this idea of several hundred lifetimes is to say that, we're not talking about a specific figure here. We're talking about the fact that this is a bond or a closeness between two individuals that has, continued over a very long period of time and even prior to this lifetime. So, and that's just for one day. So you can see that this is why causing division actually has consequences. And then this is also compared to sharing a boat. So sharing a boat here, I have a picture of a bus, because in those days, sharing a boat, this boat is just like any public transport. which these days we would think of, catching a train or catching a bus. And the people that you share that bus trip with, just talking about one trip, is also no coincidence. So it says here, the people that you share that trip with, fellow passengers, that affinity, even if you say nothing to them, you don't even remember their face, their name, but that affinity has been cultivated also over several lifetimes. And living together as spouses is a blessing cultivated over 1,000 lifetimes. So, compared to a stranger, the bond that you might have with a stranger that you happen to share this this train carriage with on the way to work for one day, is already an affinity that's been cultivated over several lifetimes, let alone someone who you share a home with, that you live together with as a spouse. So that has been cultivated over many more lifetimes. And so it's not something that's coincidental. It's certainly not something that happens in one moment. That it is something that is much more significant. And there are several, and therefore, you might then say, well, the idea that these individuals, these families come together is something that's fated, but then shouldn't their separation also be fated? And indeed, the collected commentaries of the Exalted Treatise tells us that yes, these things have their sort of they're predetermined in some way. That if this couple decides to separate, then that is something that is probably also fated, and therefore will happen anyway. We shouldn't have a part in that process. If we encourage their separation, if we provoke their separation, then that is a misdeed in itself, which will lead to demerits and which will lead to misfortune on our part. If we think that this couple were incompatible, etc., then perhaps over time they will go their separate ways. But this is not something that we should promote. In fact, what we should promote, if people come to us with their problems and trust us enough to seek help from us, then we should encourage them to look beyond their differences and to find common ground, to work together, to grow together, and overcome that challenge. Because as it says here in the saying, that it's a special affinity. In the past lifetime, maybe there was something that we had to learn from the other person, that we had to overcome together. And part of the challenges that you experience together is part of that growing process. And so as a friend, as a trusted friend, we should be able to help the couple with their problems and try to encourage them towards harmony and towards union rather than disunion or separation. So the point of the Exalted Treatise, this particular line, is telling us not to have a part in that process, even if it is unintentional. Now, there's actually several stories in the Exalted Treatise that talks about the consequences of breaking up someone's marriage. There's two stories that I will share with you. The first is a young man, a young scholar, who was foretold that he would pass the highest level of exams and come first place. In those days, there were several levels of exams, from the district to the provincial level to the metropolitan level to the palace exams, and it was foretold that he would rank or come first place in the palace level examination. So in other words, top the country, top the state, which is great good fortune. What happens is that later he's told that his fortune has changed, and he's not even going to pass the exams. And the reason is because he helped someone draft divorce papers. In those days, not everyone was literate. And so scholars would provide services for a fee to those who were illiterate to help them draft letters, write letters, etc., contracts. And so he helped out a man who wanted to divorce his wife, draft the papers for divorce. So it was not something that he encouraged, but he was just part of that process. And even just being part of that process, a very crucial part of that process, which is drafting that divorce, led him to accumulate the misdeeds and demerits such that he would not have the good fortune of even passing the exams at all. So that's the extent of this particular wrongdoing, this misdeed. So after he hears about this, he tries to make amends, and he actively tries to encourage that couple to see through their conflict and try not to go ahead with that divorce. He does this quite sincerely and to the best of his ability. And what happens is that later he does pass the exams, but only the district level exams. So it's the lowest level of the exams, and he only passes. It doesn't even say whether he comes first place, but essentially just passes, and never proceeds further. And as a result, his career is also quite limited to that of a minor official. So that change of fortune, or that misfortune that he encounters, comes about because of having a hand in someone else's marital separation. Another story is about a young man called Mr. Lee, who's quite poor, and he works as a boatsman. So, like I said, in those days, there's the boat or the ferry was just like a bus, like a public transport. So sort of part of the working class. And one day, a traveller has actually sort of left behind their wallet, which contains this 10 pieces of gold. But actually, when he asks around, no one knows who has left this, and the owner never sort of returns. So in actual fact, it ends up being his. And because he comes to the possession of this great wealth, we're talking about gold pieces here. We're not talking just about copper or silver, but he becomes quite wealthy. And because of this, the ship owner, so the person who owns those boats, decides to marry his daughter to this young man, seeing that he's now quite wealthy. And they've become engaged and about to get married. Unfortunately, during this period, so after several period of time, the rightful owner of the gold turns up to reclaim their possessions. And after very careful questioning, Mr. Lee identifies him as the rightful owner of the gold, or that wealth. And what does he do? Well, there's several options, isn't there? He could have, we think, well, first option is he could say that he doesn't know anything about the gold. He's never seen it himself, even though he has pocketed it. The second could be that he says that he sold it, it's no longer his, so he doesn't know can't give it back to him. Or the third option is that he does what is the right thing to do, even though it might be difficult, and actually gives back that gold. And that's what he does. The third option, which is that he gives it all back to that owner. Now, it's certainly not the easiest thing to do, because that would mean that he becomes poor again. And this gold, which was really what made him the perfect match for the engagement, is no longer there. But he does what is right, and all the gold is returned. Now, a distant relative of the ship owner, who actually wanted the daughter for his own son, finds out about this and tells the ship owner that now this young man, Mr. Lee, is now poor. He's returned all the gold, and it's probably not ideal for the daughter to be married to him, that the engagement should be called off, because you don't want her experiencing a life of suffering and a life of poverty. So that's what happens. The engagement is called off because of this distant relative. The young man is also dismissed from service, and the way is now clear for a new marriage proposal. So that relative wastes no time. He sort of makes the proposal and gives the first step, the betrothal gifts. But just as these gifts have been given, what happens is a great tragedy occurs, and his son actually passes away. This son that he was intending to marry for the daughter and his son to marry, the ship owner's daughter to marry, all of a sudden passes away. It's sort of like these days when you hear about this young person who passes away from sudden death. The cause is unknown, but for some reason they just collapse, and that's what happens. So again, the marriage doesn't go through. Now, what happens? Mr. Lee, who's now continues to work as a boatsman. One day, when he's sort of resting between shifts on the shore, he sort of steps on something that's quite hard. And he finds that it's a bag of 20 to 30 pieces of silver. He's sort of looking around, and there's no one that is in sight that could have claim to this particular property. And so after a period of time when no one has come to claim this property, he takes it and sells it at the market. And the first store he walks into happens to be owned by the person who reclaimed their gold from him. So this person is so happy to see him, is someone who he has been wanting to repay that kindness of honesty and returning the gold pieces. And so this person helps him sell the silvers for the highest possible price. And as a result, Mr. Lee again becomes, you could say, a very wealthy person overnight. And this, of course, this news of this spreads, and the ship owner hears about it, and again offers his daughter and marries his daughter to Mr. Lee again, and ultimately they end up being married. So I guess what this story is from the collected commentaries, what this story is trying to tell us, there are a few sort of messages here. The first is that this, what we were talking about before, that this marriage is in a way destined. This union was meant to be, in the sense that even though it was called off, he later again finds another opportunity and they become married. In the same way that the wealth was also meant to be. He does the honest thing in returning the person's lost property, pieces of gold. But then ultimately he comes into possession of 20 to 30 pieces of silvers, which is also quite a vast sum of money. And so that wealth was meant to be his, even though he returned it, he gets it back. And so you can see that by doing the right thing, this returning the property, although it may have seemed that good fortune was not forthcoming, did not, as a result of his good deed, he didn't receive good fortune. In fact, he became poor overnight and was dismissed from his job, etc. His engagement was called off. But ultimately, it was worth it. It was what needed to be done, even though it was difficult, and it was worth the effort, because ultimately he accumulates merit from this and later experiences good fortune. And finally, I guess the lesson here is that even if, let's say, the distant relative who interfered with their engagement, let's just say for the sake of understanding his motivation, that perhaps he had good intentions. He didn't want this lady, this girl, to ultimately be poor all her life, but by breaking up that engagement, it was still a misdeed, and therefore it led to misfortune, quite dramatically, in the fact that his son passes away quite suddenly. So you can see that this breaking up someone's marriage is quite detrimental, because it's not just about the relationship between two people, but it's about this affinity that they have developed over a long period of time, potentially several lifetimes, and then ultimately this union that is for the transmission and preservation of family legacy and the development of the future generation. So that's all the considerations that you need to think about. So the flip side of this is to think about, well, rather than this misdeed, we have to think about the good deed, which is to help others come together and see through their differences, to work through their differences. If they are in a marriage, if they're in a relationship, to help them preserve it and think of each other's strengths, work together in this partnership. So this is the first line that we're covering. The second line that we're covering today is the first sentence here, which is becoming arrogant on coming into wealth. And this is sort of coupled with the second line, being shameless on escaping punishment. But we'll probably only have time to cover the first line. So this idea of wealth is interesting, because it's not necessarily just becoming a millionaire. It may in fact be a small amount of fortune, but this fortune is sort of disproportionate to your usual needs, your life's needs, and therefore, as a result of that, and acquiring this wealth, you become arrogant. Now, what does this arrogance mean? Well, it's interesting, because the collected commentaries helps you work through what that arrogance might lead to, and what it means. So when we think of arrogance, of course, we think of this sense of the self that's inflated, and in a problematic way. It's not just to say that you have high self-esteem. It's this esteem of yourself in a problematic way that sort of leads to issues in your relationships and your way of living. So the first thing, of course, is that arrogance. Let's say, for example, you come into this wealth, then you might think that you have a lot because it's disproportionate to what you usually need. And all of a sudden, you're not sure what to do with it. You feel that you have a lot. And because of this feeling of having plenty, it changes how you interact with others in an adverse way. So what might this look like? Well, it may mean that you become more excessive in your lifestyle. So, you only need one car, you buy 2 cars because you can. You get to a restaurant, you order, lots of things off the menu, all of the desserts. Why? Because you can. So you become excessive. You only need one thing, but you order 10. And therefore, if going back to the example of the restaurant, you order 10 dishes, but you can only eat 2, well, what happens to the others? It becomes wasted. So you are extravagant, you have this very wasteful lifestyle, and part and parcel of that having plenty is also laxity in your daily routine, in your life. You're not as disciplined because you think you can get away with it, that this wealth or this can help you cut corners and take shortcuts in life. Now, all of this describes a kind of lifestyle, isn't it? It's not just affecting one part of your life or one relationship, but actually it's affecting all areas of your life. And you develop a kind of lavish, extravagant lifestyle. And then this leads to greed to acquire more, because this lavish lifestyle needs to sustain itself somehow. And therefore, you would need to continue to find more wealth to sustain it. And in order to acquire more quickly, that may lead to illegitimate means of attaining wealth. This could involve harming or bullying others around you, not really thinking about their rights. Say, for example, you're the director, the boss of a company, you decide to downsize to reduce costs, which means that the staff, the remaining staff, have to work twice as hard to complete the all of the various tasks. So that's one example, but it's not just in work life. It could also be in family life. For example, borrowing money from family members and not paying it back, etc. So this disdain of others comes about because of, you're just thinking about sustaining your own greed and your own lifestyle. And then ultimately, all this leads to misfortune. You're not only leading this unhealthy, extravagant lifestyle, but also all of your various relationships are being strained and tested through your arrogance, and this leads to misfortune. Now, it may not even need to wait that long. It could be in the early stages where you're already, doing things that you shouldn't, eating things that you shouldn't, which would lead to poor health, and that in itself is misfortune, even before you start to harm or bully others. So this, you can see it's quite interesting, this different stages of this arrogance that might lead to your downfall. But I want to sort of hone in on the concept of arrogance, because that in itself is very interesting. So there was an article published 2 years ago in the Journal of Chinese Philosophy, a sinologist who looked through the literature, the philosophical classical literature from early Confucian thought, so that's over 2,000 years ago, and looking at the concepts of humility and also pride or arrogance. And he's put together, sort of really teased out, what exactly does arrogance mean? What exactly does humility mean? And how can we practice it? How can we think about these terms in a way that's more, that might help us to practice it, to think about it on not just a superficial level. So he talks about, in his analysis, he picks out concept clusters. So it's just like if we were to say the idea of pride, but pride can also have overlapping meaning with arrogance, with conceit, self-importance. So all these terms have, different ideas. And if you take their equivalent sort of Chinese terms and how it was used and described in the literature by philosophers, Confucian philosophers in that time, it sort of helps us think about it in a more meaningful way. So when he analysed the terms related to arrogance, he found that there were certain ideas that came up again and again. The first is this idea that you are more elevated compared to others, that you have the sense that you're better than them in some way. And these others is not just people who that you really are better, that you may not be better than them, but you think you are. And this is not just related to wealth, so what we talked about before in the Exalted Treatise, but also it could be thinking that you're better than them in some way through your virtue, through your status, your position. So it's sort of in various aspects of life, and it could be in more than one, that you have this feeling of being above others. And therefore, as a result, you think of yourself as being more deserving, but deserving of people's high opinion of you. And you have this concern with others praising you, favoring you. It sort of occupies your mind when you have this as part of this package of arrogance. So it's not just thinking about, oh, I'm very good, but very good in what ways? And as a result of that, that leads to certain actions and thoughts, certain, ways and talking and tone, etc. So it continues by drawing out the fact that, this kind of person, this arrogance, would lead people to, try to draw attention to themselves, what they think might be their good qualities, their achievements, their successes, their efforts, the work that they've done. They want people to know about it. And all of these actions are to help them to acquire name and reputation. And part of this is where it becomes very problematic. And, it's not just that, you're in your life, you're concerned with how you look and how your reputation. That in itself is problematic, but it becomes even more problematic when what you do is to create a false appearance just to attain that fame and that name and fortune. So you actually sell yourself as something that you're not. And this could be not just in terms of wealth, your position, but also in terms of virtue. You might sort of pretend to be something that you're not. And then this is also reflected in your demeanor, your appearance, and may lead you to look down on others and ultimately slight others. So in the way you talk to them, you always have to be right, you always have to win the argument, etc., etc. So you can see how this is a more nuanced idea of what arrogance is, and you might see symptoms of this in yourself or others. So these are all things that we have to pick up on. And ultimately, Shun, he summarizes this as, arrogance is this inflated sense of self. You seek to achieve some sort of higher position, whether that's a tangible position or a sort of abstract position, in terms of always being on the high ground compared to others. And you seek to elevate yourself to reinforce this self-conception. So it's a vicious circle that once you have this attitude, this thought of arrogance, that sort of leads you further and takes you further from that path of actually working on yourself and your virtue. So then this relates to the opposite of arrogance, which is humility. So what is humility? Well, when we analyze the terms related to humility, it talks about that it's the opposite. So in contrast, those who are humble don't make a display of their success, their achievements, their work, don't claim credit, but place others before them. So here it says place themselves below others. In other words, it's not my work, it's not my credit, but actually, look at the teamwork. This is the credit that should be given to others. It's not me. It's actually the others who have made it possible. That's one dimension. Another dimension is to be yielding rather than competing. And a way of thinking about this Chinese concept of yielding is to think about its opposite, which is when you're competing with others for, first place, top position. Yielding is to say, well, you'd rather others have that, and you're happy and content with being behind. And particularly so if the other person is, in fact, more talented, skilled, etc. This often is used in relation to sort of recommending others for positions, that you would rather give up your position or that promotion in favor of those who are more worthy. So that's this idea of humility, having a very honest appraisal and evaluation of your own skills, and realizing that, in fact, you've got a lot more to learn from others, and therefore the other people around you are more worthy. There's the other idea, which is, viewing yourself in a lower position, rather than this constant need to elevate yourself to be on the high ground. In your attitude, you're more cautious. This fearful is not in a negative way, but it's just to be on guard against your vices, to be on guard against this idea of being excessive, thinking of yourself, your ego, etc., being on guard towards cultivating your virtues and your responsibilities. And then it's manifested in your respectfulness towards others, and even without others, in how you carry yourself, in your demeanor. So you can see how humility is also, in a way, a package. It's not just thinking about, okay, I have to be humble, I have to be modest, I have to think of myself as less than others. It's actually thinking about the best of others and their strengths. And that is probably how it becomes really proactive. It's not, it is not passive in the sense that when you're humble, everyone goes before you, you stay behind. It's actually more a proactive approach to life, because it's through this deflated sense of self that you're able to see the bigger picture. If you simply focus on yourself and your ego, then that's to the detriment of everything and everyone that is around you. But by thinking less of yourself and more on others, or the great bigger picture, then you're able to live life as part of a greater ethical whole, which in Confucian terms is the way. And so, whether you're thinking about it from the Confucian perspective, as we've seen here through this article, or even in the Analects, or from other traditions, it's really all telling us the same principles. So here, Confucius himself says that even though one might have the talents of someone like the Duke of Zhou, now the Duke of Zhou, who's pictured here on the right, is very interesting. Confucius and the Duke never met, but Confucius highly admired the Duke of Zhou. He was his idol, his this exemplary figure, the sage in his mind, because the Duke of Zhou was one of the founding fathers of the Zhou dynasty, someone who set up the different governmental systems, but also this kind of ritual system to help not only himself but the community, the population to cultivate themselves. And Confucius hoped that this was something that could be implemented in his times. So the Duke of Zhou was someone that Confucius really admired and thought about, to the extent that he would dream about the Duke of Zhou. So when Confucius says that someone may have the talents of the Duke of Zhou, we're talking about someone who's very talented. But he says if he employs these talents in an arrogant or a mean manner, then actually he's not worth learning from. So really this arrogance or meanness is the Achilles heel of someone who might be as talented as the Duke of Zhou. So it's something that we all have to guard against, something that Confucius himself particularly mentioned, and the importance of being humble. It's not something that he mentioned, but also that he showed in his way of life. So this is very crucial to the Confucian tradition, but it's also very central to the Taoist tradition, of which the Exalted Treatise is part of. So here, from one of the classics, early classics of the Taoist canon, is the Lao Tzu, and it talks about 3 treasures that we should try to guard and keep safe. Now, these treasures are not tangible treasures like the gold or the silver pieces, but the first is compassion, which we've talked about a lot in the Exalted Treatise, whether it's compassion for the widowed, children, the old, the people around us, or even the animals and plants. This whole idea of compassion. Frugality, which is not only sort of saving up, but sort of leading a simple life such that you can give more to others. It's about ensuring that you think of how much you need and minimize that so that you can ensure that there's more left over for others. The third one, which is relevant to what we're talking about here, is the idea of not being ahead of others. So in other words, putting yourself before others and below others. So this particular passage continues by saying that it is through compassion that we can be brave. We can really stand up for others, help others, and that sort of motivates us to act. Through frugality, we can be abundant. We can give more to others. And the third is to not get ahead of others. We can lead all, because everyone likes it when you focus on their strengths, as opposed to being egotistical and only talking about yourself and boasting about yourself. It's important as a leader to think about the needs of the people around you. And of course, doing all of this, guarding, cultivating these treasures is not so that you can be a leader, but that all of this comes about naturally. That you will be brave, you'll have abundance, and you will lead. Is actually something that comes about naturally through the cultivation of these values and virtues. So this is from the Taoist tradition. And then interestingly, recently, published in 2020, this Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Humility, brings together all different traditions, whether it's Buddhist, Islamic, but even sort of Western philosophy, psychology, etc., and talking about the need for humility for today's life. The words here have been taken from the abstract of the book, and as it says, humility is important in our political discussions, social media, self-help, and it's been linked to improved well-being, open-mindedness, increased accuracy in assessing messages, etc. So this humility is something that is all-encompassing, and it's something that we will help us in our lives. And just quickly, in this book, it also talks about the humility from the Buddhist tradition. And interestingly, arrogance, so the opposite of humility, is one of the fundamental afflictions, which then leads to suffering. But as it says here, is also part of one of the causes of this reincarnation, which then leads to endless suffering. And it's defined as placing oneself above others. And again, this idea of elevating oneself in relation to others. But it's not just sort of the idea of having an inflated sense of self. It can be the idea that you think of yourself as less than others as well. But regardless, it's the idea of that sense of ego or self, which from a Buddhist perspective is a delusion or something that shouldn't be there, because this self is the aggregation of various causal factors. So this is probably from a more abstract perspective, the idea that arrogance is something that is not just about me and what my sense of self-importance, but it's just the idea of me in the first place. So given the time, I'll stop there today. But you can see that this particular line in the Exalted Treatise, although it simply talks about the idea of wealth leading to arrogance, I think that this exploration of arrogance and its opposite, which is the need to cultivate humility, is very important in our lives. It is something that we should turn our minds to. And that's why I spent quite a bit of time on it today. The need to think of humility is not just thinking about being modest, but actually the idea that we need to cultivate our virtues in accordance with texts like the Exalted Treatise and other classics. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.